There are wounds that do not bleed. There are words that never leave a physical mark, but strike so deeply into the soul that the ache lasts for a lifetime. Sometimes the sharpest pain does not come from a raised hand or a shattered glass. It comes from a polite smile across a dining table. It comes from a gaze that lingers just a second too long on your empty lap. It comes from the suffocating silence that falls over a room full of wealthy, elegant people when someone casually mentions a newborn child. Eleanor had become intimately acquainted with every one of these subtle, invisible cruelties during the 4 years she spent married to Preston Vance. In the beginning, when they were still newlyweds living in a sprawling penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline, the comments from her mother-in-law Victoria were soft. They were wrapped in layers of expensive perfume and disguised as genuine concern. Victoria would sit in Eleanor's perfectly decorated living room, sipping tea from porcelain cups that cost more than most cars. She would lean in close and ask if Eleanor was taking care of her health. She would mention a world-renowned fertility specialist in Geneva, whispering the doctor name as if it were a tightly guarded state secret. But as the first year passed, and then the second, and the third, without the sound of a nursery being prepared, the tone shifted. The velvet gloves came off. The questions turned into statements coated in a thick, cloying layer of poison. Victoria began telling long, rambling stories at society luncheons, stories about prominent families whose bloodlines dried up because the wives were fundamentally broken. She would let the word broken hang in the air, ensuring every woman at the table understood exactly who she was talking about. Preston, for his part, remained a ghost in his own marriage. He was a handsome man, born into a fortune he never had to work for. But beneath the tailored Italian suits and the practiced charm, he lacked a spine. He never defended Eleanor. He never pushed back against his mother, passive-aggressive attacks. Instead, whenever the topic of children arose, Preston would stare down at his crystal glass as if the amber liquid inside held the secrets of the universe. That silence cost Eleanor more than any of Victoria's sharp-tongued barbs ever could. Because it was the silence of a man who agreed with his mother, but lacked the courage to say so out loud. Eleanor had loved Preston. She had married him, believing that love was a sturdy enough foundation to build a life upon. She had believed that two people could withstand any storm as long as they stood together. But month by month, dinner by dinner, she learned the agonizing truth. Love without respect is like a mansion built on sand. It looks magnificent while the sun is shining, but it collapses the moment the first dark clouds gather on the horizon. The storm finally broke on their 4th wedding anniversary, a day that should have been a celebration of their union, but instead became its execution. Victoria had orchestrated a massive dinner party at the Vance family estate in the Hamptons. The guest list included senators, banking tycoons, and the most elite figures of high society. The air in the grand dining room was heavy with the scent of roasted truffles, aged wine, and the quiet hum of predatory conversation. Midway through the extravagant meal, without a single word of warning, Victoria tapped her silver spoon against her crystal goblet. The room fell completely silent. Victoria stood at the head of the table, her diamonds catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. She looked directly at Eleanor with a cold, calculating gaze. Then she announced to the entire room that Preston deserved a real family. She spoke about the Vance legacy, about the empire that needed heirs, and about how it broke her heart to see her only son wasting his youth waiting for a barren woman to perform a miracle. The silence that followed was a vacuum. It was a cold, heavy void that sucked the air straight from Eleanor's lungs. Eleanor did not cry. Not there. Not in front of them. She slowly placed her linen napkin on the table. She stood up with the controlled rhythmic pace of someone using every ounce of their remaining soul just to keep from shattering into a million pieces. She walked out of the grand dining room, feeling the weight of 100 wealthy, judgmental eyes burning into her back. Preston came into their bedroom 20 minutes later. He stood in the doorway, looking like a man about to ask for a sacrifice he knew would destroy her. He spoke softly, his voice completely devoid of the passion she had once mistaken for love. He said that perhaps his mother was right. He said they needed to look at the future with more clarity. He murmured apologies, but not for what happened downstairs. He apologized for the fact that he was choosing his family wealth over her. Eleanor sat on the edge of the velvet bed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on a random pattern in the Persian rug. It was the most neutral place she could find to rest her gaze, while her marriage dissolved into a series of carefully chosen, cowardly words. By the time the sun began to rise over the Atlantic Ocean painting, the sky in shades of bruised purple and cold gray, Eleanor was already gone. She packed only what she had brought into the marriage: a few simple dresses, some books, and a silver locket her grandmother had given her. She left behind the diamond necklaces, the designer gowns, and the suffocating weight of the Vance family name. Preston lawyers had tried to offer her a generous settlement. It was a substantial sum of money designed not to help her, but to buy her absolute silence. They wanted her to disappear quietly, so Preston could quickly remarry someone younger, someone capable of producing the precious heir Victoria demanded. Eleanor looked at the legal documents slid across the polished mahogany table and felt a profound sense of disgust. She did not take a single penny. She signed the divorce papers, left the pen on top of the contract, and walked out of their pristine corporate office with nothing but her unyielding dignity. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in the cruelty of high society. Women who had once invited her to charity galas and called her their dear friend suddenly crossed the street when they saw her. Her name became a cautionary tale whispered over champagne flutes and caviar. She was the discarded wife, the barren woman who failed her single most important duty. Eleanor moved into a tiny, damp apartment on the outskirts of the city. The space was barely large enough to hold a bed and a small table. But for the first time in 4 years, she could breathe without asking for permission. She needed to survive. She needed to work. A discreet placement agency that catered to the ultra-wealthy contacted her. The head of the agency, an older woman who had always respected Eleanor. Quiet Grace offered her an unusual position. The job was not in the city. It was at a secluded, heavily guarded estate hours away in the dense forests of upstate New York. The owner was Harrison Sterling. Harrison Sterling was a name that commanded absolute fear and respect in the financial world. He was a self-made billionaire, a ruthless corporate raider known for dismantling monopolies and crushing his rivals without a flicker of emotion. But the rumors about his personal life were darker. He was a widower. 2 years ago, a tragic accident had claimed the lives of his brother and sister-in-law, leaving Harrison as the sole guardian of their young son Theodore. Since then, Harrison had retreated from the public eye, ruling his vast empire from the shadows of his fortress. The agency told Eleanor that the boy was deeply traumatized, They had gone through 6 nannies in 3 months. The child refused to speak, and the CEO had no patience for failure. Eleanor accepted the job immediately. She did not care about the isolation or the demanding nature of the billionaire. She desperately needed to be somewhere no one knew her past. Somewhere she could simply disappear into the background. The drive to Sterling Manor took her deep into the wilderness, where the trees grew so thick they blocked out the sun. The estate itself was a massive stone fortress of Gothic architecture, imposing and entirely uninviting. It looked less like a home and more like a beautifully constructed prison. When the heavy iron gates closed behind her cab, Eleanor felt a strange sense of finality. There was no turning back. Martha, the head housekeeper, greeted her at the heavy oak doors. Martha was a stern woman with sharp eyes, but there was a faint glimmer of warmth beneath her rigid exterior. She led Eleanor through hallways lined with priceless art and dark wood paneling. The house was immaculate, but it felt completely devoid of life. It was a museum of grief, a place where joy had been systematically erased. Eleanor's first meeting with Harrison Sterling happened in his massive, dimly lit study. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the rain-swept landscape. When he turned to face her, Eleanor felt the air leave the room. He was a tall man with shoulders that carried the weight of a massive empire. His face was all sharp angles and hard lines carved by stress and relentless ambition. But it was his eyes that struck her. They were a piercing shade of steel gray, entirely unreadable and fiercely intelligent. He did not look at her the way Preston used to, looking past her as if she were an accessory. Harrison looked directly at her, analyzing her, stripping away her defenses with a single sweeping glance. He did not offer a polite greeting. He walked behind his massive oak desk and stated the rules of the house with a voice that was deep resonant and utterly commanding. He told her that he demanded absolute punctuality. He expected the boy to be educated, fed, and kept out of his way during working hours. He warned her that Theodore was difficult, and that if she could not handle the child, she would be on the next train back to the city before nightfall. Eleanor stood her ground. She did not flinch under his intense scrutiny. She looked back into his steel-gray eyes and told him calmly that she understood the requirements. She did not offer empty promises or nervous chatter. Her quiet strength seemed to surprise him, if only for a fraction of a second. He nodded once, dismissing her without another word. Later that afternoon, Eleanor met Theo. The 5-year-old boy was sitting in the middle of a grand playroom, surrounded by expensive toys he was completely ignoring. He was small for his age, with pale skin and dark hair that fell over his eyes. He sat perfectly still, staring blankly at a spot on the wall. The silence in the room was not peaceful. It was the heavy, agonizing silence of a child who had seen his world end and had decided to lock himself inside his own mind to survive. Eleanor did not rush toward him. She did not force a bright, fake smile or speak in a high-pitched, sing-song voice like the previous nannies had done. She knew what it felt like to be completely broken, and she knew that broken things do not heal when they are forced. She walked slowly into the room and sat on the floor a few feet away from him. She crossed her legs, resting her hands gently in her lap. She did not ask him his name. She did not tell him to look at her. She simply existed in his space, offering a quiet, steady presence. For an hour, neither of them moved. The grand-grandfather clock down the hall ticked away the minutes. Finally, Theo shifted. He turned his head ever so slightly and looked at her. His eyes were wide and filled with a profound, devastating sorrow that no child should ever have to carry. Eleanor looked back at him, her expression soft and completely devoid of pity. She understood that look. It was the look of someone waiting for the next bad thing to happen. Someone waiting to be abandoned. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small wooden horse she had found in the library. She placed it gently on the floor, exactly halfway between them. She did not push it toward him. She left it there a silent invitation. Then she stood up, smoothed her skirt, and told him softly that she would be right outside if he needed anything. As she walked toward the door, she heard the faintest sound of wood scraping against the floorboards. She glanced back over her shoulder. Theo's small hand was wrapped around the wooden horse, holding it tightly against his chest. A tiny flicker of warmth ignited in Eleanor's battered heart. It was a very small victory, but in a house buried under a mountain of grief, a small victory was everything. The first month at Sterling Manor passed in a quiet, deliberate rhythm. Eleanor did not try to force joy into the cold stone walls of the estate. She did not attempt to paint over the heavy grief that hung in the air with bright colors or loud music. Instead, she moved through the massive house like a gentle current of warm air, slowly and persistently thawing the frost that had settled over its inhabitants. Her days were entirely devoted to Theodore. The young boy remained completely mute, a prisoner trapped behind the iron bars of his own trauma. The previous nannies had tried to bribe him with expensive toys or discipline him with strict schedules. Eleanor did neither. She simply offered him the one thing he had been completely denied since the tragic accident that took his parents. She offered him a safe, unconditional presence. She began to take him out of the sterile, pristine playroom. She led him to the sprawling glass greenhouse at the back of the estate, a place overgrown with wild ferns and exotic blooms that the groundskeepers had mostly neglected. Eleanor would kneel in the rich, dark soil, ignoring the fact that it stained her simple cotton dresses. She would gently coax Theo to sit beside her. She showed him how to plant tiny seeds, how to pack the soil around the fragile roots, and how to water them just enough so they could grow. At first, Theo simply watched her, his small hands tucked safely into his pockets. But on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, as the rain drummed a steady hypnotic beat against the glass roof of the greenhouse, Theo reached out. His small, trembling fingers touched the dark soil. He picked up a tiny green seedling and looked up at Eleanor for permission. She nodded, giving him a soft, encouraging smile that demanded absolutely nothing in return. Theo planted the seed, and for the first time in 2 years, a tiny, fragile ghost of a smile touched the corners of the little boy's mouth. From his private office on the 3rd floor, Harrison Sterling witnessed the entire interaction. He had been standing by his window, reviewing a multi-billion-dollar acquisition contract, but his steel-gray eyes were locked on the greenhouse below. He watched the woman in the faded dress sitting in the dirt with his nephew. He watched the boy, who had screamed in terror at the touch of strangers, leaning comfortably against Eleanor's shoulder. Harrison gripped the edge of his mahogany desk, his knuckles turning white. He was a man who controlled global markets, a man who could dismantle empires with a single phone call. But he had been entirely powerless to save his nephew from the dark abyss of grief. Yet this quiet, unassuming woman, who had arrived at his door with nothing but a small suitcase and eyes full of hidden shadows, had accomplished what armies of child psychologists could not. Something shifted inside the cold, calculating chest of the CEO. A microscopic crack appeared in the impenetrable fortress he had built around his heart. That evening, the dynamic of the Sterling household changed. Normally, Harrison would have his dinner brought to his study, consuming the gourmet meals while poring over endless financial reports. But at 7 o'clock, the heavy oak doors of the grand dining room swung open. Harrison walked in, wearing a dark tailored suit that emphasized his imposing, terrifyingly powerful frame. Martha, the head housekeeper, nearly dropped the silver tray she was holding. Eleanor, who was sitting quietly next to Theo at the far end of the impossibly long table, froze. She immediately prepared to stand up and leave, assuming the master of the house wished to dine alone. Harrison stopped her with a single deep word, commanding her to stay. He walked to the head of the table, sitting down with an effortless, fluid grace. The silence in the massive dining room was thick, but it was no longer the oppressive, terrifying silence of the past. It was a heavy, crackling silence charged with an unspoken tension. Eleanor kept her eyes on her plate, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was conditioned by 4 years of marriage to Preston Vance to expect criticism at the dinner table. She waited for Harrison to comment on her posture or to mock the simple way she ate. She waited for the inevitable psychological blow. It never came. Harrison did not speak, but he watched her. He watched the gentle, intuitive way she cut Theo meat into tiny, bite-sized pieces. He watched the way she instinctively knew when the boy wanted water before he even had to point at the glass. He observed the elegant, graceful curve of her neck and the way she carried herself, not like a servant, but like a dethroned queen who had lost her kingdom, but never her dignity. Unlike Preston, whose presence always felt like a suffocating cage, Harrison's presence felt like a massive, immovable mountain. It was intimidating, yes, but it also felt profoundly safe. It was the presence of a man who did not need to tear others down to make himself feel powerful. Later that week, the invisible string pulling them together pulled a little tighter. It was past midnight, and a fierce thunderstorm was raging outside. The lightning cast long, jagged shadows across the dark hallways of the estate. Eleanor could not sleep. The thunder reminded her too much of the loud, terrifying arguments with Victoria Vance. She slipped out of her room and walked down to the massive 2-story library, seeking the comforting smell of old paper and leather bindings. She did not turn on the main chandelier. She sat in a velvet armchair by the window, illuminated only by the flashes of lightning and a single small reading lamp. She was reading an old volume of poetry when she heard the faint click of the library door closing. Harrison stood in the shadows. He was not wearing his armor of tailored suits. He wore dark slacks and a simple black linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing strong corded muscles and the faint trace of a scar. His dark hair was slightly messy, stripping away the polished billionaire facade and revealing the raw, dangerously attractive man underneath. He walked slowly toward her, moving with the silent, lethal grace of a predator. He did not ask what she was doing there. He looked at the book in her lap and noted the title. He leaned against the heavy wooden bookshelf, crossing his arms over his broad chest. His intense, steel-gray eyes locked onto hers, refusing to let her look away. In a low, gravelly voice that sent a shiver straight down her spine, he observed that she did not sleep much. Eleanor replied softly, stating that the quiet of the night was sometimes easier to handle than the noise of the day. Harrison stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. The air between them grew thick, heavy, with an electric charge that had absolutely nothing to do with the storm outside. He stepped closer. He was so close she could smell the intoxicating scent of sandalwood cedar and raw male power that radiated from his skin. He told her in a voice that was almost a rough whisper that she moved through his house like someone waiting for a trap to spring. He asked her who had made her believe that she had to constantly look over her shoulder. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The sheer intuition of this man was terrifying. Preston had lived with her for 4 years and never noticed the pain in her eyes. Harrison Sterling had known her for a month, and he was already reading her soul like an open book. She looked down at her hands, the deeply ingrained shame of her past rising to the surface. She told him quietly that she came from a place where she was considered defective. She confessed, without giving away the names, that she had failed to provide the one thing her previous family required of her. She told him she was barren. She waited for the disgust to wash over his aristocratic features. She waited for the billionaire who demanded perfection to finally look at her with the same condescending pity the rest of the world had shown her. Harrison did not move away. Instead, he reached out. His large, warm hand gently touched her chin, tilting her face up so she was forced to look directly into his fierce, uncompromising eyes. His touch sent a shockwave of heat straight to her core. He told her with absolute, terrifying certainty that the people in her past were blind fools. He said that value is not measured by biological utility, and that a woman's worth is not determined by the demands of arrogant cowards. His thumb gently traced the line of her jaw, a touch so incredibly soft, it completely contradicted the lethal reputation of the man giving it. He murmured that what he saw was not a defective woman, but the strongest, most resilient person he had ever met. For the first time in years, the frozen wasteland inside Eleanor's heart truly began to melt. A single tear escaped her eye, sliding down her cheek. Harrison did not wipe it away. He simply stood there, anchoring her to the earth, silently promising that in this fortress, no one would ever be allowed to break her again. The shift in the atmosphere at Sterling Manor was palpable. It was no longer just a cold stone fortress holding two isolated souls. The heavy, suffocating fog of grief that had choked the life out of the massive estate was slowly lifting, replaced by the soft, gentle warmth of Eleanor's presence. But the true test of this fragile new reality arrived in the dead of winter, wrapped in the terrifying cloak of a midnight crisis. It was mid-January, and a brutal blizzard had descended upon upstate New York. The storm was a howling monster, burying the roads under feet of snow and cutting the estate off completely from the outside world. The wind slammed against the heavy reinforced glass of the manor, sounding like a pack of starving wolves trying to break in. At 2 a.m, Eleanor was violently awakened by a sound that made her blood run entirely cold. It was a cry, a high-pitched, ragged gasp of sheer agony coming from Theodore's bedroom down the hall. She did not hesitate. She did not bother to grab a robe. She sprinted down the freezing corridor in her thin cotton nightgown, her bare feet slapping frantically against the hardwood floor. She burst into Theo's room and found the boy thrashing wildly in his bed. He was burning up. His small body was radiating a terrifying amount of heat, and his face was flushed a dangerous deep crimson. He was struggling to pull air into his lungs, gasping in harsh, agonizing rasps. Eleanor rushed to his side, gathering the small, trembling boy into her arms. She pressed her cheek against his forehead and felt panic spike hard in her chest. His fever was dangerously high. Before she could shout for help, the door flew open again. Harrison stood in the frame, his massive presence instantly dominating the chaotic room. He had clearly thrown on a pair of dark sweatpants, and nothing else his broad, muscular chest, rising and falling heavily. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his face a terrifying mask of controlled panic. He demanded to know what was happening, his voice sharp and commanding. Eleanor did not cower. She looked up at the powerful billionaire, her eyes blazing with fierce maternal instinct. She told him the boy had a severe fever and was struggling to breathe. She commanded Harrison to call the estate doctor immediately. Harrison pulled out his phone, his jaw clenched so tight, a muscle ticked in his cheek. He dialed the number, pacing the room like a caged panther. But a moment later, he threw the phone violently against the wall, shattering it into pieces. The lines were down. The cell towers were out. The blizzard had completely isolated them. They were entirely on their own. For a fraction of a second, the great ruthless CEO looked entirely helpless. The man who could manipulate global economies was paralyzed by the sight of his nephew fighting for air. The ghosts of the tragic accident that had claimed his brother seemed to swarm the room, threatening to drag him back into the abyss. But Eleanor did not freeze. She could not afford to. She took absolute control. She snapped an order to the billionaire, telling him to stop pacing and to go to the kitchen to bring back cold water ice and every clean towel he could find. She did not ask him. She ordered him. Harrison did not argue. The CEO, who never took orders from anyone, spun on his heel and sprinted down the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. For the next 6 grueling, agonizing hours, the sprawling master bedroom became a battlefield. Eleanor refused to leave the boy's side. She sat on the edge of the large bed, holding Theo's small, fragile body against her chest. She constantly bathed his burning face, his neck, and his chest with freezing water, her own hands turning numb and pale from the ice. Harrison worked right beside her. The billionaire dropped entirely to his knees beside the bed, his expensive slacks soaking wet from the ice water. He helped her wring out the towels, his large, rough hands brushing against her freezing fingers. They moved in perfect silent synchronization, a desperate, terrifying dance to keep the little boy tethered to the living world. Throughout the nightmare, Eleanor murmured softly to Theo. She spoke to him in a low, soothing cadence, telling him stories about the stars, about the horses in the fields, and about how he was the bravest boy she had ever known. She poured every single ounce of her soul, every drop of the love she had been saving for the children she was never allowed to have, directly into the shivering boy in her arms. Harrison watched her. He watched the fierce, terrifying devotion radiating from this woman. He watched her sacrifice her own comfort, her own body heat, to keep his nephew alive. She was not acting like a hired nanny trying to secure a paycheck. She was acting like a mother fighting a war for her child. Around 5 in the morning, as the storm outside finally began to exhaust its fury, the terrifying heat radiating from Theo's body slowly began to recede. The harsh, gasping breaths softened into a steady, rhythmic pattern. The boy muscles relaxed, and he sank into a deep, healing sleep. Eleanor collapsed back against the heavy wooden headboard, utterly depleted. Her thin cotton nightgown was soaked through with sweat, and ice water clinging tightly to her curves. She was shivering uncontrollably, her lips a faint shade of blue. But as she looked down at the peacefully sleeping boy, a beautiful, exhausted smile touched her face. Harrison stood up slowly. His joints ached, and his chest was tight with an emotion he had completely forbidden himself to feel for years. He looked at the sleeping boy, and then he looked at the woman sitting on the bed. He did not say a word. He walked to the heavy oak wardrobe, pulled out a massive thick wool blanket, and returned to the bed. He wrapped the heavy blanket gently around Eleanor's shoulders, but he did not step back. He sat down on the edge of the mattress right beside her, pulling her freezing, trembling body firmly against his solid chest. Eleanor gasped softly at the sudden contact, but she did not pull away. She was too exhausted, too incredibly cold, and the heat radiating from Harrison's large, powerful body was absolutely intoxicating. She rested her head carefully against his broad shoulder, listening to the steady, heavy thud of his heart. Harrison wrapped his strong arms around her, holding her securely against him. He rested his chin on the top of her head, burying his face in the soft scent of vanilla and rain that belonged entirely to her. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a deep, gravelly vibration that resonated straight through her chest. He told her that he had spent his entire life building fortresses. He had built corporate empires and massive stone mansions to protect the things he cared about. But he confessed quietly, holding her tighter, that none of it meant a damn thing until she walked through his doors. Eleanor closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek and soaking into the dark fabric of his shirt. She whispered that she was entirely broken. She reminded him one last time of the terrifying label the world had stamped upon her. Harrison shifted, pulling her slightly away so he could look directly into her eyes. The raw, fierce intensity in his steel-gray gaze made her breath catch. He lifted his hand, his thumb gently brushing away the tear on her cheek. He told her with absolute devastating authority that she was not broken. He told her that a woman's worth is not measured by the shape of her body or the cruelty of her past. He leaned in his face, inches from hers, his breath brushing hotly against her lips. He murmured fiercely that she had breathed life back into his dead heart. She had saved his nephew. She was the absolute center of his world. And then he kissed her. It was not a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a fierce, desperate claiming. Harrison kissed her like a starving man who had finally found sustenance. He poured all his suppressed desire, all his terrifying power, and all his profound gratitude into that single, earth-shattering kiss. His large hand tangled in her hair, holding her in place while his lips devoured hers, demanding that she finally understand how incredibly precious she was to him. Eleanor melted completely against his chest. Years of rejection, years of being told she was useless and unwanted, completely vanished in the blazing inferno of the billionaire touch. She kissed him back, wrapping her arms around his strong neck, anchoring herself to the man who saw her not as a flawed vessel, but as an absolute queen. When they finally pulled apart, breathing heavily, their foreheads rested against each other. Harrison looked down at her, his eyes burning with a possessive, unwavering fire. He told her quietly that she was never leaving this house. He told her she was home. Spring arrived at Sterling Manor, not just as a change of season, but as a profound resurrection. The heavy snow melted away, revealing vibrant green lawns and blooming gardens. The fortress that had once been a tomb of grief was now filled with the bright, echoing sound of Theodore laughter. The boy who had once stared blankly at walls was now running through the halls, chasing after the estate dogs, his eyes entirely full of life. Eleanor had blossomed alongside the spring. The shadows that had haunted her eyes were entirely gone, replaced by a radiant, confident glow. She was no longer the discarded, broken wife of the Vance family. She was the absolute heart of the Sterling Empire. She and Harrison had not yet labeled their relationship to the outside world, but within the heavily guarded walls of the estate, they were completely inseparable. Harrison treated her with a level of worship that left her breathless. He was a man who commanded thousands of employees and dictated global markets, yet he would cancel board meetings just to sit in the greenhouse and watch her plant roses. He would wrap his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder, completely ignoring his ringing phones just to breathe in her scent. But the past has a nasty habit of clawing its way back to the surface when you least expect it. The Vance family empire was crumbling. Without Eleanor quiet, intelligent management behind the scenes, Preston reckless investments had finally caught up with him. His new wife, a young socialite chosen solely for her pedigree, had zero interest in business and spent his dwindling fortune on frivolous luxuries. Worse, she had not yet provided the male heir Victoria so desperately demanded. Facing total bankruptcy, Preston and Victoria managed to secure a highly coveted 10-minute meeting with Harrison Sterling, begging for a massive bailout loan. They arrived at the heavily fortified gates of Sterling Manor on a bright Tuesday morning. Victoria stepped out of the hired Blacktown car wearing a ridiculous oversized fur coat and a haughty expression. Preston trailed behind her, looking nervous and desperate, adjusting his silk tie with sweaty hands. Martha, the head housekeeper, escorted them into the grand marble foyer, instructing them to wait while Mr. Sterling finished a phone call. Victoria could not simply wait. Her arrogance drove her to wander. She sneered at the expensive art on the walls, mentally calculating how much she could sell it for if she owned it. She pushed open the heavy glass doors leading to the private back terrace, and there, standing near the grand fountain bathed in the morning sunlight, was Eleanor. Eleanor was wearing a simple, elegant white sundress, her hair cascading over her shoulders in loose waves. She was laughing brightly, tossing a small ball to Theodore, who was giggling uncontrollably. Victoria stopped dead in her tracks. Her perfectly manicured face twisted into a mask of pure ugly shock, which quickly morphed into vicious, venomous delight. She marched onto the terrace, the sharp click of her heels echoing like gunshots against the stone. Preston hurried behind his mother, his eyes widening as he recognized his ex-wife. Victoria did not bother with a polite greeting. Her voice, shrill and entirely devoid of class, sliced through the peaceful morning air. She loudly mocked Eleanor, calling her a pathetic little maid. She laughed a cold, cruel sound, stating that it made perfect sense for a barren, useless woman to end up scrubbing floors in the middle of nowhere. Eleanor turned around, the bright smile fading from her face. She looked at the woman who had made her life a living hell for 4 years. She looked at Preston, who stood there, shifting his weight, cowardly, refusing to make eye contact with her. Victoria took another step forward, her eyes gleaming with toxic triumph. She announced to the open air that she supposed Eleanor was happy playing pretend mother to a stranger child, since her own womb was completely broken. She spat out the words, stating that the high and mighty CEO probably hired her out of pure pity. Preston finally found his voice, attempting to sound authoritative. He told Eleanor to fetch Mr. Sterling immediately. He ordered her to make herself useful for once in her miserable life, and informed the billionaire that the Vance family was waiting. Eleanor did not flinch. She did not lower her eyes. The woman who would have once curled in on herself and cried under their verbal abuse was entirely gone. She stood tall, her spine straight, looking at the two pathetic figures before her with absolute icy calm. Before she could even open her mouth to reply, the temperature on the terrace seemed to drop by 20 degrees. A dark, terrifying shadow fell over the Vances. Harrison Sterling stepped out onto the terrace. He was wearing a bespoke three-piece charcoal suit that fit his massive muscular frame to terrifying perfection. His face was carved out of granite, and his steel-gray eyes burned with a lethal, murderous fury. He radiated an aura of raw, unchecked power that instantly suffocated the air right out of Victoria's lungs. He walked slowly, unhurriedly past the trembling mother and son. He went straight to Eleanor, wrapping a strong, possessive arm around her delicate waist, pulling her flush against his solid chest. He looked down at her, his expression softening for a fraction of a second, checking to make sure she was okay. Eleanor nodded, leaning comfortably into his protective embrace, entirely unbothered by the trash standing a few feet away. Harrison turned his lethal gaze back to the Vances. Victoria swallowed hard, her arrogance instantly evaporating under the crushing weight of the billionaire stare. She attempted to put on a sickly sweet smile, stuttering a greeting, introducing herself as the matriarch of the Vance enterprise. Harrison did not let her finish. His voice was completely flat, devoid of any emotion, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. He stated that he knew exactly who she was. He said he knew she was the woman who ran a multi-million-dollar company straight into the ground in less than a year. Preston tried to puff out his chest, trying to salvage his shattered pride. He nervously cleared his throat and mentioned the bailout proposal they had sent, offering a 20% stake in their failing company in exchange for a massive loan. Harrison let out a dark, terrifying chuckle. He tightened his grip on Eleanor's waist. He looked directly at Preston, stripping away the man-dignity layer by agonizing layer. He stated that he had read the proposal. He told Preston that the Vance Company was entirely worthless, heavily in debt, and bleeding money, because it was run by an incompetent coward. Victoria's face turned a mottled shade of red. She desperately pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Eleanor, claiming that they were honorable people who simply needed a bridge loan. She spat out that Harrison should not let the lies of a bitter Barren maid influence his business decisions. The silence that followed that statement was deadly. It was the terrifying calm before a catastrophic explosion. Harrison's jaw clenched. His eyes darkened into black voids. He took one single step forward, shielding Eleanor completely with his massive body. He spoke his voice a deep, booming growl that vibrated the very stones beneath their feet. He informed Victoria Vance that she was not speaking to a maid. He declared with absolute world-shattering authority that she was standing in the presence of the future Mrs. Sterling. He told them that Eleanor was the sole owner of his heart, the mother to his nephew, and the undisputed queen of his entire empire. Preston's jaw dropped completely open. He looked at Eleanor, realizing in a horrifying flash of clarity that the quiet, unassuming woman he had thrown away like garbage was now wearing the protective armor of the most powerful man in the country. He realized he had traded a priceless diamond for a handful of worthless dirt. Harrison was not finished. He pulled his cell phone from his tailored pocket, his eyes never leaving the trembling, pathetic figures before him. He tapped a single button, dialing his chief financial officer on speakerphone. The voice on the other end answered immediately. Harrison issued a direct lethal order. He commanded his team to buy up every single outstanding debt the Vance family owed to any bank in the state. He ordered them to call in the loans immediately and to initiate a hostile takeover of their remaining assets before noon. He instructed his team to strip the Vance name from every building, every charity board, and every country club in the city. Victoria let out a strangled, horrifying gasp. Her knees physically gave out. She collapsed onto the hard stone terrace, her expensive fur coat pooling around her like a dirty rag. She began to weep, begging, pleading for mercy, screaming that they would lose absolutely everything. Preston stood entirely frozen, tears welling in his eyes, completely emasculated and utterly destroyed by a single phone call. Harrison looked down at them with absolute disgust. He stated coldly that they had thrown away the most valuable thing that ever entered their miserable lives. He told them that they were officially bankrupt, and that if they ever came within 100 miles of his wife again, he would make sure they spent the rest of their pathetic lives rotting in a federal prison. He snapped his fingers. Two massive estate security guards immediately stepped out from the shadows, dragging the sobbing Victoria and the paralyzed Preston off the terrace and out of the estate, tossing them out like the garbage they truly were. The silence returned to the garden, broken only by the gentle splashing of the fountain. Harrison turned back to Eleanor. The lethal, terrifying predator vanished instantly, replaced by the man who looked at her as if she hung the stars in the sky. He reached out gently, framing her face with his large, warm hands. He apologized softly, stating that he should have destroyed them months ago. Eleanor smiled a genuine, beautiful smile that reached her eyes. She placed her hands over his, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his pulse. She told him that they did not matter anymore. She said that looking at them, she felt absolutely nothing but pity. She had completely healed. The weeks following the dramatic expulsion of the Vance family were the most profoundly peaceful days Eleanor had ever experienced. The lingering ghosts of her past, the constant nagging voices of doubt, and the deeply ingrained shame she had carried for years were entirely incinerated by the protective fire of Harrison Sterling. She was no longer hiding in the shadows of a grand estate. She was the undisputed master of it. One spectacular evening in late October, the sky over the dense upstate New York forest was painted in breathtaking strokes of burnt orange, deep violet, and shimmering gold. The air was crisp, carrying the fresh scent of pine and falling leaves. Eleanor was standing on the grand stone terrace, watching the sun slowly dip below the tree line. She heard the heavy, familiar footsteps behind her before she felt the warmth of his massive body. Harrison stepped up behind her, wrapping his strong arms securely around her waist, pulling her back against his solid chest. He rested his chin on top of her head, exhaling a long, contented breath. For a man who carried the weight of a global empire on his shoulders, this was the only place he ever truly rested. A moment later, the heavy glass doors slid open, and little Theodore stepped out onto the terrace. The boy was dressed impeccably in a miniature dark suit, looking exactly like a tiny version of his powerful uncle. His eyes were bright, and his face held a massive, excited smile that he was desperately trying to keep secret. He walked up to Eleanor and Harrison, his small hands clutching a square velvet box. Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat. She looked from the small boy to the towering billionaire holding her. Harrison gently turned her around so she was facing him. The fierce, lethal CEO, the man who terrified Wall Street bankers and ruthlessly crushed his enemies, looked at her with an expression of absolute, profound vulnerability. He did not drop to one knee. A man like Harrison Sterling bowed to absolutely no one, but he looked at her as if she were his entire religion. He spoke his deep, gravelly voice, vibrating with pure emotion. He told her that he had spent his entire life building walls to keep the world out. He had believed that power and isolation were the only ways to survive the devastating losses he had suffered. He looked deep into her eyes, stating that when she arrived at his door, she did not try to break his walls down. Instead, she simply brought the light inside and made his fortress a home. Harrison reached down and took the velvet box from Theodore. He opened it, revealing a breathtaking, flawless diamond ring that caught the fading light of the sunset. It was a ring fit for an absolute queen. He told Eleanor that she had arrived broken by people who were completely blind to her worth. He vowed with terrifying intensity that he would spend every single day of the rest of his life proving to her that she was the most perfect, flawless piece of his soul. He asked her not just to stay, but to rule by his side as his wife and as the mother to the boy they both loved so deeply. Theodore stepped closer, tugging gently on Eleanor's dress. The little boy looked up at her, his dark eyes shining with pure hope, and said the word he had not spoken in over 2 years. He called her Mom. Tears of absolute, overwhelming joy spilled down Eleanor's cheeks. The word hit her heart like a physical force completely shattering the final remaining piece of ice inside her. The woman who was told she would never be a mother was standing on a beautiful terrace holding the hands of the 2 most important people in the world. She looked at the little boy and then up at the massive, powerful man who had given her a completely new life. She smiled a radiant, beautiful smile and said yes. Harrison let out a sound that was half laugh, half sigh of absolute relief. He slipped the heavy diamond onto her finger and then pulled her into a deeply passionate, soul-shattering kiss. Theodore cheered loudly, throwing his small arms around both their legs, anchoring them together as a true, undeniable family. There is a profound lesson that life eventually teaches us often after we have walked through the long, dark, agonizing tunnels of rejection and inadequacy. The lesson is that our value is absolutely never determined by the people who are unable to see it. We often spend our youth and our middle years trying desperately to fit into molds that were never meant for us. We measure our entire worth by the yardsticks of those who have no genuine interest in our growth, only in our utility. Eleanor's journey from the suffocating, toxic judgment of her first marriage to the expansive, undeniable love of the Sterling estate is a testament to a powerful truth. What one person calls a void or a defect is often just an empty space waiting for the exact right person to inhabit it. For years, she believed she was a total failure because she could not provide what Preston and Victoria demanded. She never realized that the failure was entirely theirs. It was their massive failure to see a woman as a whole beautiful human being rather than a simple vessel for their arrogant expectations. As we grow older and hopefully wiser, we begin to realize that the most profound healing does not come from fixing what we think is broken. True healing comes from finding a place where our so-called brokenness is not even considered a flaw. In the eyes of Harrison and Theodore, Eleanor was never a woman who lacked children. She was the absolute radiant force who brought warmth to a freezing cold mansion. She brought stability to a grieving, traumatized boy, and she brought undeniable light to a powerful man who had completely forgotten how to look at the sunset. The incredible beauty of the human experience lies in the absolute fact that we can be entirely wrong for one person and perfectly, unconditionally right for another. The ultimate trick is having the sheer courage to walk away from the places and the people where we are constantly diminished. It takes a certain kind of seasoned, beautiful wisdom to finally understand that being enough is not a status you achieve by meeting a list of shallow criteria. It is a fundamental truth of your very existence that only requires the right witnesses to be fully acknowledged. Life has a profound way of leading us through the dark wilderness, not to punish us, but to aggressively strip away the false identities we have adopted just to please others. When Eleanor stood on that terrace wearing the diamond of a billionaire and holding the hand of her new son, she was not a different person than the one Victoria had viciously insulted at that dining table. She was the exact same woman. She had the exact same heart, the exact same soul, and the exact same capabilities. The only thing that had changed was her environment and the eyes that looked upon her. This is the quiet, breathtaking grace of maturity, the powerful realization that we do not ever need to change our core essence to be deeply loved. We only need to find our way to the people who recognize our essence as an absolute, priceless gift. Sometimes, the greatest act of self-love is simply packing your bags and moving your life to a completely different set of coordinates where you can finally breathe. So, if you find yourself currently sitting in a heavy silence that feels like judgment, if you are carrying the suffocating weight of someone else's disappointment in you, please remember Eleanor and the Sterling estate. Remember that the soil that is considered entirely barren for one crop may be the absolute, perfect, magnificent foundation for another. Your worth is not a negotiation. Your life is not a performance for a toxic audience that refuses to applaud. There is a profound, quiet power in simply existing exactly as you are. And there is a family out there, whether born of blood or chosen in the quiet, deeply intimate moments of a shared life, that is waiting for exactly what you have to give. The journey might be long, and the winters of isolation might be incredibly cold, but the morning sun absolutely always comes for those who are brave enough to keep their internal fire lit. Eleanor found her ultimate peace, not by breaking herself to become what they wanted, but by staying entirely true to who she was, until she found the powerful man who had been looking for her his entire life. If Eleanor's deeply emotional journey of healing and finding true love resonated with your heart today, please take a moment to gently tap the like button and subscribe to our channel. We love bringing these powerful stories of second chances and protective romance to you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic situation to finally find where you truly belong? We read every single comment, and we cannot wait to hear your beautiful stories. Until next time, remember that you are absolutely enough exactly as you are.